President Trump has overseen more federal executions than any other president, sparking outrage from liberal Supreme Court justices. 13 executions have been carried out at the federal level since July. That is more executions in 6 months than in the past 56 years. Several of them took place during Mr. Trump's final days in office. The president is expected to issue up to 100 pardons and commutations before President-elect Joe Biden is sworn in. Mark Joseph Stern covers courts and the law for Slate, and he joins me now from Washington. Mark, thanks very much for being with us. Executions are rare during a presidential transition. Why is that, and why did the Trump administration decide to move forward with these executions?
Well, these kinds of executions during a transition are essentially unprecedented, not just rare, and there are a few reasons. Number one, as a general matter, a president in his last weeks is winding up, closing up business, not launching new efforts to kill human beings who are in federal custody. Number two, this is a very time-consuming, energy-intensive process. The Justice Department, the federal government, has to push really hard to get these executions to occur. They have to spend a lot of time persuading courts that they are lawful, overcoming appeals. And this is something that the Trump administration has prioritized in its final weeks, when every other administration in American history has decided that it would rather leave this business to the incoming new president.
Well, we know District Court originally blocked the 13th execution, but the Supreme Court ended up clearing the way. Why did the High Court side with the Trump administration?
So the Supreme Court's conservative justices have taken a very skeptical view of requests for a stay of execution. They have said essentially that they think these are efforts to game the system, to just keep putting off executions indefinitely. And so they have decided to almost automatically turn away these kinds of appeals from individuals on death row. And that's what we've seen in the most recent spate of executions. A lot of these individuals raised very compelling claims that either they were intellectually disabled, that their executions would cause cruel and unusual punishment, that they did not comport with the federal law that governs executions. But the conservative justices simply swatted away those appeals and said, you know what, we're going to make sure this happens as the president wants it to happen, and we're not going to entertain these requests because we think the death penalty is lawful, and that means there has to be a lawful way of carrying it out.
So Justices Stephen Breyer and Sonia Sotomayor sharply dissented. What were their arguments?
Justice Sonia Sotomayor and Stephen Breyer both pointed out what I just noted, that the conservative majority has essentially decided to shut down these requests for a stay of execution almost automatically. And to them, that's a really perverse position, because this is, of course, the ultimate punishment. This is a final punishment that cannot be undone. And so both of these justices said, look, if we're going to let the government do this, then at a minimum, it should be absolutely sure that this is legal. The courts should have made sure that every component of this execution and this sentence comply with the Constitution and with federal law. And we aren't doing that anymore. We're just allowing these executions to occur with, at most, a cursory review of the appeals. And I think there was both a kind of law-based outrage here about defying all of these precedents and defying customs, and also some moral outrage about the nonchalant, blasé attitude that the conservative majority has taken with regard to the killing of a human being by the government. I think the liberal justices view that as a very grave matter, and the conservative justices think it's just another day of government business.
Well, what is President-elect Joe Biden's stance on federal executions, and how could that impact the 50 people who remain on federal death row?
So Joe Biden says he now opposes the death penalty, and he is going to put a moratorium on federal executions when he enters office, which is good news for those 50 individuals who are still on federal death row. The problem, of course, is that the next Republican president who comes in can simply end that moratorium and resume executions, as Trump did. And so the real push among criminal justice reformers right now is to get Joe Biden Biden to commute these sentences, not just to hit pause on the federal death penalty, but to essentially end it by commuting every current death sentence to life in prison without parole. Biden has not committed to this position yet, but a lot of people across the political spectrum, frankly, there are some conservatives who are very opposed to the death penalty. They are lighting a fire on this because they think this may be a kind of once in a generation chance to finally halt the federal machinery of death.
Well, switching gears, Mark, you also write about the power of presidential pardons. President Trump could issue up to 100 pardons in his final day in office, yet you argue that clemency is, quote, an indispensable tool. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is a really tragic situation, I think, because so many Americans have come to see clemency as a sort of a corrupt process. They see Donald Trump giving clemency to his cronies, to corrupt Republican office holders, to abusive law enforcement officers, and wonder why should the president have this power, which is almost unlimited, right? There's nothing Congress or the courts can do to stop a presidential grant of clemency. But the reality is that this could be and should be a really important tool to combat mass incarceration. That the framers of the Constitution added it for a reason. They understood that the criminal justice system, left to its own devices, can end up being too severe, too draconian. Clemency is supposed to be a safety valve to ensure that doesn't happen. And so I'm very worried, and I think a lot of criminal justice reformers are very worried, that Biden will step back and not grant pardons and not commute sentences because he doesn't want to be viewed as corrupt like Trump. But that's the exact opposite thing he should be doing. If I were in his shoes, I would try to prove that Trump misused this process by deploying it correctly, by looking at nonviolent offenders who are languishing in prison for decades and saying they shouldn't be there anymore, by freeing rehabilitated people from cages. You know, pardons are the ultimate act of mercy. They should be given out generously to people who deserve them, not simply to cronies, as Trump has done to try to bolster his own political and personal fortunes.
Well, there has been so much focus in the last year about criminal justice reform and the inequalities that we know exist systemically. It'll be interesting to see whether this actually, rises to the forefront here in terms of the many, many priorities that the Biden administration is going to be facing here. Mark Joseph Stern, thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks so much.